Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip away from the soft hum of your everyday and descend into the scorching, breathless abyss of Egypt's Valley of the Kings. You feel the grit of the Theban sandstone between your toes, a dry, ancient dust that hasn't moved in 3 millennia. The air is thick, the kind of heavy heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin instantly, even now, in the false coolness of your imagination. You're standing right where Howard Carter and his crew stood in November 1922, gazing up at the brutal cliffs that cage the valley. Don't let the romance of the Golden Mask fool you. This is a place of hard, back-breaking labour, blinding sunlight and lethal secrets. The history books, the shiny ones with the perfect photos, tell a beautiful lie, a clean, convenient story of a triumphant discovery. Tonight, you're going to dig past that facade, past the tourist boards, and into the sweat-soaked, ethically dubious reality of what actually happened. You're searching for the tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun, but the true prize is the story they tried to bury. Just a friendly reality check. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed by disillusionment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what's the local time? Post it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You squint, shielding your eyes from the fictional yet perfectly harsh Egyptian sun. You've come here, to the Valley of the Kings, searching for one of the few great prizes still believed to be hidden. The air smells not of history but of donkey sweat, strong tobacco, and the faint sweet scent of 1,000 unbloomed possibilities. For 3,300 years, the body of a minor pharaoh, Tutankhamun, a king so insignificant that his name was literally chipped off monuments by his successors, has rested somewhere beneath this brutal landscape. Yet, by some bizarre twist of fate, his unremarkable tomb would become the single most remarkable discovery in archaeological history. Imagine yourself standing beside Howard Carter. He's a man you instinctively know is wound too tight. A solitary figure with a weathered face and a perpetual scowl that seems to be carved directly into his skull by years of disappointment and sunstroke. It is 1922, and he has been digging here fruitlessly for 15 long years. He's not the heroic, suave archaeologist of the movies. He's a meticulous, obsessed artist who started as a draftsman and became an excavator out of sheer force of will. The widely accepted mainstream historical fact is that by 1922 virtually everyone had given up on finding any intact major tomb in the valley. The French, the Germans, the Americans. They'd all had their turn using increasingly aggressive methods, and the consensus was that the valley was worked out. Any untouched royal burial was a romantic fantasy. When you look at the topographical maps, you see a veritable Swiss cheese of shafts, tunnels, and spoil heaps. Yet Carter, with a stubbornness bordering on delusion, held on to one central idea. The location of the tomb of a pharaoh named A, Tutankhamun's successor, suggested that Tut's own burial must lie in the small triangular area of unexcavated bedrock beneath the workers' huts that housed the crews of earlier expeditions. It was a fringe theory, a pure gut feeling based on a deep, almost mystical knowledge of the valley's layout, and it made him a laughingstock among the more academically inclined archaeologists. You feel the frustration radiating off Carter, a palpable heat greater than the sun's. You trudge past the entrance of KV-9, the tomb of Rameses VI, which is the very spot that had defeated earlier efforts. Why? Because over the mouth of that Ramesside tomb, ancient workers had built their temporary rest huts. When that tomb was finally rediscovered in the 19th century, the debris from its excavation, the literal rubble the workers had dug out, was dumped right back down into the central area where Carter now focuses his gaze. For a quirky tidbit of local history that the official narrative rarely mentions, those workers' huts, dating to the Ramesside period, acted as a perfect natural preservative, covering and protecting Tutankhamun's resting place for 3 millennia. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of historical preservation through laziness, a brilliant accident. Carter had actually dug in this spot before, years earlier, but had been forced to stop when his clearance was deemed to be getting too close to the existing open tombs, potentially destabilising them. He was that close to his destiny, and was called off, a moment of profound, career-defining bad luck. and historians still argue whether the location was true genius or pure statistical chance, given that the final area he focused on was literally the last 10 square metres of undug ground in the valley. Was it his unique, deep time intuition, or did he simply run out of places to look? He's walking you now past the area, a quiet, nondescript flat of rock and compacted earth that looks no different from any other stretch of the valley floor. He stops and points with a lean brown finger at the base of the cliffs, where the Ramesses the Sixth tomb entrance plunges into the rock. It's here, he might have grumbled to himself. It must be. Carter's financial lifeline was an eccentric, wealthy, and sometimes exasperating English nobleman George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Imagine Lord Carnarvon. He is the diametric opposite of Carter. Smooth, well-dressed, a man who has perfected the art of leisure. He is the money man, a title that carried both immense power and utter boredom for him. Carnarvon came to Egypt not for history but for health. He'd been in a serious motoring accident and the dry, warm climate was prescribed for his slow recovery. He quickly realised that digging for treasures was a much more exciting, though expensive, pastime than merely basking in the sun. He needed a digger, and Carter needed a patron. It was a marriage of necessity, not affection. "My lord, you're looking a little pale. Perhaps too much champagne in Cairo?" The joke falls flat, but you appreciate the visual. The contrast between the dusty, sun-scorched Carter and the perpetually fresh, slightly bored Carnarvon. This partnership, built on a mountain of money and a shared, almost impossible dream, was about to snap. Carnarvon had already spent a fortune year after year with only minor finds to show for it. Mostly just pottery shards and the occasional broken statue fragment. He was not a man known for his patience, especially when his wallet was involved. You sense the impending climax of the first act of this drama. Carter's persistence is admirable, but it's paid for by a man whose patience is thinner than a dry papyrus leaf. The stage is set. The last few square metres of the valley floor, an archaeologist hanging on by a thread of stubborn belief, and a very large chequebook about to be decisively closed. The entire world of Egyptology is about to be turned upside down, but first, one man has to be persuaded to spend just a little bit more money. This wasn't merely a slow scientific process, it was a high-stakes professional gamble, and in 1922 Howard Carter was running on fumes and a prayer. The scorching wind picks up, swirling dust devils across the valley floor, and you instinctively shield your face with your hand, feeling the harsh abrasive kiss of the sand. You're still standing next to Carter, absorbing the quiet desperation of a man who knows he is one season away from professional oblivion. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, is currently back in England, probably sipping a fine claret at Highclere Castle, the real-life Downton Abbey, and reviewing the abysmal balance sheets of the last excavation season. Carnarvon's folly, as some in London society sneeringly called it, was costing him a staggering amount of money, and for what? A few broken pots, and Carter's unwavering conviction that a forgotten pharaoh's treasure was just inches away. To understand the immense pressure now crushing Carter, you have to appreciate the financial scale of this undertaking. The mainstream historical fact is that by the end of the 1921 to 1922 digging season, Carnarvon had invested approximately £30,000 in the concession over a decade and a half. In today's money, that figure represents millions of dollars. To be a patron in this era was to underwrite not just the salary of the archaeologist, but the wages of dozens of Egyptian workmen, the cost of equipment, logistics, and the endless diplomatic expenses required to keep the Antiquities Service happy. Carnarvon wasn't just funding a dig, he was sustaining a small year-round operation in one of the most remote and challenging locations on Earth. You watch as Carter paces, his shadow long and thin in the late afternoon sun. He is obsessed, yes, but he is also pragmatic. He knows that his contract for the concession, the exclusive right to dig in the valley, is about to expire, and that Carnarvon is his only hope for renewal. Without Carnarvon's money and his aristocratic influence in Cairo, Carter is simply a dismissed technician with a bad temper. The nobleman, however, was rapidly losing faith, and rightly so from a purely business perspective. A quirky tidbit that illustrates Carnarvon's dwindling enthusiasm. His earlier excavations had mostly been confined to the tombs of nobles in the Theban hills, which had produced lovely, yet relatively common, artefacts for his growing private collection. The shift to the Valley of the Kings, searching for a royal burial, was Carter's insistence, a dramatic escalation of ambition. Carnarvon tolerated it, largely because he was fond of Carter, but he certainly didn't share the same feverish certainty. He was a collector of beautiful objects. Carter was a seeker of absolute historical truth. Their motivations were fundamentally mismatched. You can almost hear the imaginary terse telegrams flying between Egypt and England. Carter's must have been full of technical details and appeals to the historical significance of the last unexplored patch. Carnarvon's replies, however, would have been brutally simple. Is there gold? No. Then stop. The moment of reckoning came in the summer of 1922. Carter returned to Highclere to make his final desperate appeal. You envision the scene, the plush velvet, the roaring English fireplace, the smell of leather and polish, all in stark contrast to the dust and heat of Luxor. Carnarvon, a man of ease, listens patiently as Carter, the man of dust, lays out his map, his theories, and his profound, unwavering belief that the tomb of Tutankhamun lay directly beneath the foundation of the workmen's huts built over KV-9. Carter didn't just ask for money, he offered a desperate bargain. "My lord," you hear him say, his voice strained with years of hope and failure, "I will bear the cost myself if nothing is found this season. Just grant me one final, all-out effort in that specific triangular spot." He knew he was bankrupting himself with that promise, but the obsession was too deep. And here is where historians still argue whether Carnarvon's final decision was based on reluctant generosity, shrewd calculation, or simple exhaustion with the constant begging. Did he genuinely believe Carter, or did he simply want to be rid of the project forever and was willing to write one last check to see the end of it? Many scholars lean towards the latter, that Carnarvon viewed this fifth season as the final expenditure required to close the books on his decade-and-a-half-long archaeological folly. He was signing off on an expensive failure, a clean break. Regardless of his motivation, Carnarvon grudgingly agreed. He gave Carter a final, tightly constrained budget and an explicit mandate. One last season, targeting only that tiny, previously inaccessible patch of ground. If nothing materialised by Christmas, the concession would be abandoned, the funding cut off forever, and Carter would be free to pursue his cartographic work, his career as an excavator effectively over. You now understand the sheer existential weight on Carter's shoulders as he returned to Luxor in the early autumn of 1922. Every shovelful of dirt, every hour of sunlight, was not just an archaeological effort. It was a race against the calendar and against financial ruin. The pressure to succeed was not merely about finding a king. It was about saving his own professional life. He knew that the main reason they hadn't found anything before was the sheer volume of debris, the taffel, that had been piled high in that small section from the later excavation of Ramesses VI's tomb. Earlier explorers, focused on the deeper burials, had used the space as a convenient dumping ground. Carter's task now was to remove this mountain of refuse, which was essentially a 3,000-year-old parking lot, and systematically scrape down to the bedrock underneath. Imagine the scene. The heat is unbearable, and the air is filled with the rhythmic grunt of the men, the metallic clang of shovels against rock, and the ceaseless dry rustle of the taffel being cleared. It's monotonous, demoralising work. Carter watches over them, every minute detail under his scrutiny, his eyes scanning the cleared ground for any subtle change in the consistency or colour of the earth that would betray a discontinuity, the faint, nearly invisible line that would indicate a cut into the bedrock for a descending staircase. You realise that this final season was not starting with a bang, but with a weary sigh. It was a last, desperate act of cleaning up someone else's mess, hoping that underneath the detritus of a later, more successful excavation lay the untouched proof of a forgotten one. He was literally scraping the bottom of the valley, and everyone, from his crew to the local antiquities inspectors, was convinced he was wasting his time. He was betting his career on a single, isolated patch of dry earth that had been completely overlooked because of its proximity to an already known magnificent tomb. The ultimate irony: a great pharaoh's tomb was protected by the literal trash pile of another, later pharaoh's workman. Carter's only real advantage was his unique, almost fanatical attention to where things had been, which informed where something must be. The clock was ticking, and the failure was already priced into Carnarvon's ledgers. The heat is relentless, even as you imagine the short Egyptian digging day coming to a close. You feel the grit settle in your throat, a constant reminder that you are participating in a desperate last-ditch effort. Carter and his crew, a brilliant and loyal team of Egyptian workmen, have returned to the valley on November 1st, 1922, the beginning of the fifth, and by all accounts, final season under Carnarvon's sceptical patronage. The agreement is firm. Failure means abandonment. You can almost feel the collective anxiety radiating from the small camp. This final mandate wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. Carter had been subtly sidelined by the rising stars of the American and German schools of archaeology, whose methods were often flashier, if not always more rigorous. He was determined to prove his intuition right. He starts by focusing his efforts precisely where he believed the ancient workman's path had gone, right at the foot of the entrance to the tomb of Rameses VI, KV9. The mainstream historical fact is that this season's work began with the systematic dismantling of the ancient workmen's stone huts. These structures, dating back to the 20th dynasty, had long been seen as simple, later additions to the valley landscape, archaeological nuisances that marked the spot where previous explorers shouldn't dig. Carter, however, saw them as his compass. If the huts were built on top of the original sealed surface of the valley floor, then anything beneath them must predate their construction, and the space they occupied was exactly the triangle of land that had remained unexplored. It sounds so simple, yet it had been overlooked by decades of high-profile academic excavators who were too focused on the deeper known areas of the valley. You watch as the men carefully dismantle the mud, brick and stone remnants of these small, humble dwellings, layer by careful layer. This isn't the dramatic swinging of picks and axes, it's methodical, almost painstaking work, designed not to miss a single clue. Every grain of sand, every fragment of pottery is scrutinised. The frustration is thick because for the first few days all they find is what they expected. The foundations of the huts, the broken tools of the ancient workers, and the taffel, the debris from the excavation of the later royal tombs. It's boring, hard work. The kind of work that breaks a man's spirit if his faith isn't absolute. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates Carter's almost maniacal preparation for this final season. He had specifically requested and received a new, highly accurate levelling instrument from England. He wasn't relying on old maps or rough measurements. He was obsessed with finding the exact original level of the bedrock and cutting through the accumulated fill. This level of precision, treating every millimetre of the ground as sacrosanct, was often ridiculed as over-the-top fussiness by his peers, yet it was precisely this meticulous approach that would pay off. He wasn't looking for a huge structure, he was looking for a minor, almost imperceptible interruption in the geology. And that is what brings us to the core tension of the moment, the reason why historians still argue whether Carter's method was superior or just incredibly fortunate. The tomb was almost certainly missed by the American explorer Theodore Davis years earlier. Davis had found a few minor objects bearing Tutankhamun's name, fragments of pottery, and a small cache of funerary equipment, and wrongly concluded that the boy king was likely buried elsewhere, and that these items were simply transferred from an original smaller tomb. Did Carter succeed because he was more patient and scientific, or did he simply arrive at the tiny, unexcavated spot years after Davis, who, had he only dug a few feet lower and 20 feet to the east, would have snatched the prize? It's a debate that pits methodological rigour against the capricious nature of luck. The third day, November 4th, 1922, dawns like any other. The sun climbs quickly, and the heat begins its slow, steady assault. You're standing with the Rees foreman, a man named Ahmed Gergao, who oversees the core group of men working directly beneath the dismantled huts. The work is slow. The men are using hand baskets, scraping the surface with small torias, picks, and wide trowels, ensuring they go down evenly. The agreement with Carnarvon is a heavy presence, a ticking clock in the dry air. Every minute spent here digging up old bricks and broken tools feels like money down the drain. Carter had staked everything, his reputation, his savings, his entire professional future, on this tiny patch of the valley floor. The pressure is immense. You feel a slight shift in the air, a subtle tension that cuts through the monotonous rhythm of the work. You don't see anything, but you hear a sound change, the scrape of a tool against something solid and uniform, something that is not natural bedrock or loose taffel. Then a shout, a clear, sharp call in Arabic from a young water boy named Hussein, who was one of the men helping to clear the area. He hadn't been digging directly. His job was to fetch water and remove the baskets. He trips over something hard embedded in the earth. He calls the rays over, and the scraping begins again, more focused now. You lean closer, watching the dirt being cleared away, and there it is. The sight that changes everything. Not gold, not treasure, but something far more potent. A clearly defined, worked stone. It is the top edge of a man-made limestone step, cut deeply into the bedrock. It is completely covered in dust and debris, but its sharp 90-degree angle is a profound interruption in the natural chaos of the earth. Carter isn't there for the immediate moment of discovery, a fact often softened in the romantic accounts. He's back at the dig house dealing with paperwork or perhaps nursing a headache induced by the perpetual stress. But the moment the Aries sees that top step, he knows instantly what it means. You realise that a sealed tomb is not found by finding a magnificent door, but by finding the first, humble step that leads down to it. It is the beginning of a descent into 3,300 years of darkness. The word is sent immediately to the dig house. The atmosphere shifts from dull resignation to white-hot, heart-thumping terror. Terror that this is another false alarm, or worse, the entrance to a small, already looted tomb. But the Rees is experienced. He recognises the scale and the quality of the workmanship of that single exposed step. It's too solid, too neatly cut to be just a storeroom. It suggests a significant structure, and in this part of the valley that means one thing. Carter arrives, his usual stoicism barely containing a visible tremor of excitement. He drops to his knees, scraping the dirt away with his bare hands, running his fingers along the straight edge of the step. You watch him calculate in his mind the depth, the angle, the position relative to the surrounding tombs. Every fibre of his being screams, this is it. The final mandate, the reluctant check, the 15 years of obsessive searching, all crystallised in this one, simple, flat piece of stone. It's a moment of profound, vindicating silence before the world-changing noise begins. The air thickens with anticipation. You can almost taste the adrenaline and the centuries-old dust. You're kneeling right beside Carter on that fateful morning of November 4th, 1922. The moment when all the despair and years of dogged failure evaporated into the dry electric heat. The initial report was right. Beneath the foundations of the Rameside workmen's huts, precisely where Carter had insisted, the first, beautifully cut step of a staircase descends into the bedrock. You watch as Carter quickly organises the removal of the remaining surface rubble. The men, their earlier apathy replaced by a furious energy, work with focused precision. This isn't a frenzy, it's a controlled eruption of hope. As they clear the surrounding area, more steps reveal themselves, one after the other, plunging down into the shadows. You count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. The steps are wide and perfectly shaped, designed for solemn funerary procession, not merely utilitarian access. This reinforces the thrilling realization. This isn't a private tomb, and it's not a mere cash pit. This is the entrance to a major installation. The mainstream historical fact here is critical to understanding the state of preservation. The staircase was cut not into a simple slope, but nearly vertically into the taffel and bedrock, and crucially it was immediately filled in and covered. This process of intentional rapid burial soon after the interment of the king is what protected it from the waves of large-scale professional tomb robbers who had plagued the valley in antiquity. The robbers tended to go for the easier, more exposed entrances, or those that required less extensive excavation. This one was hidden beneath the debris of another tomb's construction, making it virtually invisible. By the end of that first day, you see 12 steps cleared. The descent is steep, and at the bottom of the 12th step, the workers' trowels hit not the solid stone of the bedrock, but a wall of tightly packed chips, rubble, and mortar. This is the fill of the descending passageway, and it means the passage itself ends in a doorway. Carter, typically reserved, is incandescent with quiet excitement. He orders the fill to be removed cautiously. As the workers dig out the packed debris, you realise that this is not the work of ancient stonecutters, but of ancient labourers sealing the tomb after the burial ceremony. The discovery of a sealed doorway, deep in the Valley of the Kings, is a rarity. and its presence suggests that the tomb had not been fully rifled. Then comes the moment of profound clarity. As the workers clear the fill down to the level of the sealed door, they reveal something that makes Carter gasp, a sound that cuts through the dry air. Embedded in the plastered and mortared ceiling of the doorway, the impressions of a stamp, a clay bulla, are visible, and here is where the story gets its first major shot of adrenaline. A quirky tidbit is that Carter initially didn't recognise the exact identity of the pharaoh from the seal impression, but he did recognise the seal of the ancient necropolis administration, the seal of the jackal and 9 captives. This seal was the official stamp of the royal guards responsible for protecting the dead, meaning that whatever lay beyond this door had been officially secured by the highest authorities of the time. The sense of discovery moves from the personal victory of Carter to a moment of major historical import. The seal impressions are partially blurred, smeared by the wet mortar used to seal the door, but Carter can make out the cartouche, the oval rope representing the pharaoh's name. It is the name of Tutankhamun. He has found the Boy King's tomb entrance. You stand there, a silent witness to a moment of monumental, historical vindication. Carter has not just saved his career, he has rewritten the final chapter of royal burials in the valley. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, a peculiar detail emerges that historians still argue about. There are distinct signs of 2 separate periods of sealing. The lower half of the door shows the intact seal of the necropolis, but the upper half appears to have been broken open, resealed and stamped with a different, slightly earlier cartouche. This duality immediately suggests a complex history. It implies that the tomb was not untouched. It means that sometime after the initial burial, the tomb was entered, almost certainly by ancient robbers, and subsequently discovered by necropolis officials, who then resealed the breach. The crucial question is, how successful were the original robbers? The intact lower seal offers hope, but the patched upper seal is a clear warning that the chamber beyond may be empty. The immediate temptation, of course, is to punch a hole through that upper damaged seal and slip inside. The door is the only thing standing between Carter and the answer to his life's quest. But Carter, the meticulous professional, resists. He knows that his funding comes from Carnarvon, who is currently 3,000 miles away. His concession requires the presence of his patron for the official formal opening. To proceed now, alone, would be a professional and financial betrayal. The delay is agonizing. He covers the door and the cleared steps with sand and debris once more, taking meticulous care to ensure the tomb's entrance is invisible to anyone casually walking by. He places a small, low-paid guard, or gaffir, on the site, instructing him to keep absolutely silent about the find. The tomb, having waited 3,300 years, must now wait a few more weeks for an Englishman to sail across the Mediterranean. The sun begins to set, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. The emotional whiplash of the day is exhausting. You realise that the greatest challenge is not the digging, but the waiting. Carter immediately retires to the dig house to compose the most important telegraph of his life, a message that will change not only his destiny, but the world's perception of ancient Egypt. The desert night has cooled the stones, but the electric charge of discovery still hums in the air. You stand guard with the local gaffir, a silent sentinel over the hastily reburied steps. The memory of that first sight, 12 perfect limestone steps leading to a sealed, plastered door, is burned into your mind. That door, with its clay belay bearing the cartouche of Tutankhamun and the seal of the jackal, is the epicenter of a silent historical earthquake. The mainstream historical fact that Carter was agonizing over is the composition of the ceiling. It wasn't one solid block of stone, but a door made of plastered rubble, a temporary structure meant to be broken for the resurrection ritual. The crucial observation was the evidence of intrusion. The door showed a clean vertical line where the lower half was plastered and sealed with the original necropolis seals, perfectly intact. Above this line, however, the plaster was rougher, the rubble more haphazardly packed, and the seals, though still bearing the king's name, were clearly a resealing. This was the work of ancient officials, the police of the dead, who had caught robbers, patched the hole, and put their stamp back on it. This told Carter that the tomb had suffered at least 1, possibly 2 intrusions shortly after the burial, but the officials had managed to resecure it. The question was, what, if anything, remained inside? You mentally reconstruct the scene. The original burial, lavish and rushed, would have occurred around 1323 BCE. The tomb was sealed, the stairs filled, the workmen's huts built over the spot. Then, perhaps within a decade or two, thieves noticed the loose patch of rock or some telltale sign of digging. They burrowed down, broke through the upper part of the first door, and perhaps even made it into the tomb's outer chamber, known later as the antechamber. They were likely caught by the necropolis police, an ancient version of the FBI whose seal you saw. Or maybe they were just in a hurry and didn't have time to properly ransack the place. The officials then meticulously restored the damage, filling the hole, plastering over it, and applying fresh seals, essentially giving the king a second chance at eternal rest. A quirky tidbit that often gets lost in the rush to the gold. The evidence of this hasty resealing was vital because it explained why the tomb was not an all-or-nothing prospect. Most unrobbed tombs had completely intact seals from top to bottom. This one was partially compromised, a term Carter would use later. The ancient thieves, it was theorized, were targeting easily portable valuables like oils, unguents, and precious metals. They might have ignored the massive furniture or the smaller, less valuable religious artifacts. You realise that Carter's decision to rebury the steps and wait for Carnarvon was not merely protocol. It was a masterful tactical move. If he had proceeded alone and found an empty chamber, Carnarvon would have cut off funding instantly. By reporting the discovery of a sealed tomb bearing Tutankhamun's cartouche, even a partially disturbed one, he was guaranteeing the Lord's immediate presence and, more importantly, guaranteeing that the required funds and official permissions for the immensely difficult job of excavation would follow. Historians still argue whether Carter should have waited at all. The temptation to just peek must have been overwhelming. Critics point out that the 2 to 3 week delay allowed for potential security issues, despite the guard, and that the modern focus on formality over scientific preservation was a product of the class dynamics of the era. However, the counter-argument is that waiting ensured the discovery was documented by the official patron, lending it the credibility and publicity required to properly fund the gargantuan task of clearing and cataloguing the thousands of objects that were, hopefully, inside. Without Carnarvon's money and influence, the tomb would have been officially opened, summarily cleared, and the contents dispersed by the Egyptian Antiquities Service with far less scientific rigour. Carter, the professional, knew this discovery needed a global spotlight and a deep pocket to be done right. As dawn breaks, you see the outlines of the valley sharpen. Carter is gone, already planning the logistics. His first priority is the telegraph. He must communicate the unprecedented nature of his find without giving away too much, lest the news leak to the voracious Cairo press before Carnarvon arrives. You imagine him sitting at a small dusty desk in the dig house, pen in hand, struggling to find the appropriate tone, a blend of scientific sobriety and restrained triumph. He can't use hyperbole. Carnarvon would dismiss it. He must use facts. The message he crafts is a masterpiece of understatement. The words chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to provoke immediate, panicked excitement in a wealthy, thrill-seeking nobleman. It needs to be direct, undeniable, and yet leave everything to the imagination. The fate of the entire excavation, and indeed the course of modern archaeology, hangs on these few carefully chosen phrases. The simple act of sending a telegraph across the world becomes the second great moment of this discovery. You watch as the runner is dispatched, sprinting towards the nearest telegraph office, a long, agonizing run in the morning heat. The silence left behind in the valley is profound, the silence of history holding its breath. The tomb of Tutankhamun, having escaped discovery for 33 centuries, now faces its greatest enemy, the impatient, competitive world of 1922, hungry for gold and headlines. Carter has done the hard part, finding the door. Now he must navigate the even harder part, the politics of possession. The final, hidden step of this initial discovery is the composition of that vital, life-changing message to Highclere Castle. The run to the telegraph office is done, and the message is on the wires, hurtling out of the desolate valley and across the globe toward the plush, comfortable reality of Highclere Castle, the seat of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. You imagine the breathless intensity with which Carter chose every single word, knowing the future of the concession, and his own career, rested on a few shillings worth of Morse code. The mainstream historical fact is that the telegram Carter sent to Carnarvon on November 5, 1922 was famously succinct. Have at last made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same pending your arrival. Congratulations. This message is a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. Notice the key phrases. At last. Appealing to Carnarvon's years of patience. Wonderful discovery. Satisfying the need for excitement. And most importantly, seals intact. This last phrase, as you know from studying the patched doorway, was a deliberate optimistic oversimplification. The seals were partially intact and the door was clearly resealed, but by stating seals intact, Carter assured Carnarvon that they were not merely opening an empty, looted hole, they were opening a pharaoh's tomb, secured by the ancient police force. You can practically feel the agonising delay now settling over the dig house. The discovery was made on November 4th, the telegram sent on the 5th. Carnarvon, enjoying the British autumn, would have to arrange passage immediately. He had to be coaxed, but also cornered. By recovering the steps and the door, another fact Carter included, he made it impossible for the necessary official entry to be performed without the patron's presence. This forced Carnarvon to make the journey, whether he wanted to or not, cementing his central official role in the discovery and ensuring the necessary funding followed. The true genius of the delay wasn't just to await the patron, it was to manage the inevitable leak to the press. If news of the discovery of a sealed tomb of a pharaoh, named Tutankhamun, had broken before Carnarvon was on Egyptian soil, the ensuing chaos would have been insurmountable. The press would have descended like locusts, the Egyptian Antiquities Service would have imposed an immediate and total lockdown, and the entire operation would have devolved into a messy public relations nightmare. By having the official patron present, the story could be tightly controlled and released under terms favourable to the excavators, a crucial detail for the narrative that would follow. During this waiting period, a quirky tidbit revolves around Carter's intense paranoia. He was absolutely terrified that the local Egyptian workers, who knew exactly what they had found, would leak the news or, worse, attempt to break through the recovered doorway. Carter did more than just post a gay fear. He reportedly spent his nights sleeping in the valley near the recovered steps, armed and alert. Imagine the scene. The celebrated archaeologist, a man of refined tastes and meticulous habits, sleeping rough on a pile of dusty sacks, gripping a rifle, his ear pressed to the silent earth above the secret door. This wasn't merely guarding a tomb, it was guarding his life's work and the promise he had made to himself. The intense, almost fanatical commitment to secrecy during these tense weeks is a testament to the high-stakes nature of the find. You realise that this enforced, agonising wait created the perfect conditions for the events that historians still argue about. The possibility of an early, clandestine entry. The original plan was to wait 3 weeks for Carnarvon to arrive in Luxor from England. That's 3 weeks staring at a sealed door, knowing that a king's treasure, or at least the answer to the greatest archaeological mystery of the decade, was inches away. Carter was not a man known for his patience, especially when his obsession was within reach. The temptation for Carter and his small inner circle, perhaps his second-in-command, Arthur Callender, to make a tiny, unauthorised breach into the chamber, to gauge the contents and ensure the delay was justified, would have been enormous. Why risk Carnarvon's trip and the ensuing media circus if the tomb turned out to be empty, or if the ancient thieves had been fully successful? The official narrative states that they waited dutifully. The circumstantial evidence and later discoveries of smaller high-value objects outside of their documented locations suggest a very different, far more human, and certainly less formal process. The official opening would be a spectacle, but the real first look, the moment of pure, raw discovery, may have happened in secret under the cover of that desert night, long before Carnarvon ever set foot back in Egypt. You feel the weight of this anticipation. Carter is performing a magnificent balancing act. Publicly, he is the picture of professional restraint, waiting for his patron. Privately, he is a man on the verge of cracking, guarding a secret that is heavier than the stones he recovered. This waiting game transforms the scientific discovery into a theatrical production, setting the stage for the global phenomenon that the world knows as Tutankhamun's tomb. The tension isn't just about the gold, it's about the narrative, the control of the story that will be told to the world. The sun beats down on the valley, but a cold, heavy stillness has settled over Carter's camp. The telegram is a memory. The reality is the relentless passage of time. You're trapped in the agonising 3-week vacuum between the moment of discovery and the arrival of Lord Carnarvon. The official narrative would have you believe Carter was the model of patient restraint, tending to paperwork and calmly planning the meticulous clearance. The truth, however, is woven with the thread of intense hidden activity and growing temptation. You realise that Carter had to maintain 2 contradictory states simultaneously: a public facade of normal, quiet maintenance, and a private, frantic state of vigilance. The mainstream historical fact is that during this period, Carter brought in his trusted technical assistant Arthur Callender, a meticulous engineer, to begin the logistical planning for cataloguing thousands of objects. This wasn't just a casual visit. Callender was tasked with preparing the entire operation, organising storage boxes, setting up photography equipment, and ensuring the delicate objects could be preserved once exposed to the modern air. This level of preparation suggests a deep certainty about the tomb's contents, a certainty that, officially, Carter had no right to possess without having first breached the door. Imagine the nights. The valley is an intensely silent place after dark, the silence broken only by the howl of jackals, an ironic echo of the very seal on the tomb door. Carter, as you recall from the previous section, was sleeping rough near the site, not out of eccentricity, but out of a paralysing fear of looting, both ancient and modern. He knew that the local workmen, though loyal, were now holding a secret worth more than their lifetime wages. This intense scrutiny and the overwhelming temptation led to the possibility of clandestine activities, a quirky tidbit that modern scholarly research strongly suggests. The intense psychological pressure of waiting was a furnace, and Carter was the most impatient man in Egypt. Historians still argue whether Carter and Callender made an unofficial secret inspection of the tomb during these 3 weeks. The circumstantial evidence is compelling. When the tomb was officially opened and cleared, several small, high-value objects, including pieces of jewellery and small royal amulets, were found scattered in the initial passage fill, outside the sealed doorway, and in the debris around the tomb entrance, never officially logged or photographed in place. Furthermore, the small passage leading from the antechamber to the burial chamber was found to be largely cleared of the original debris, suggesting someone had been through. You consider the scenario: a tiny, carefully concealed hole bored through the upper, resealed section of the door under the cover of a moonless night. A candle pushed through the gap, a quick, agonising glimpse into the antechamber, enough to confirm the spectacular nature of the contents, and thus to confirm that Carnarvon's rushed, expensive trip was warranted. It would have been a profoundly unprofessional act, a breach of every archaeological protocol, yet a deeply human and pragmatic one. Carter needed to know the risk was worth the reward. He needed to be sure that what he was guarding was indeed a king's ransom, not an empty shell. This act of quiet, almost certainly undocumented trespass is the dark, untold reality of the waiting game. This brings us to the crucial point historians still argue whether this secret entry was a justifiable pre-investigation or an act of opportunistic initial theft. Critics suggest that high-value objects like a small golden box, a scarab pendant, and parts of the king's fan, which later appeared in Carnarvon's personal collection, or were documented with vague provenance, were spirited away during this undocumented period. This theory argues that Carter and Carnarvon sought to secure a few high-value items before the official inventory began, ensuring they had some personal compensation for the long, expensive search, regardless of the ultimate fate of the officially recovered goods which legally belonged to Egypt. Whether or not they entered, the tension of the wait was palpable. The whole world was about to converge on this tiny forgotten spot. The delay, enforced by the necessity of managing a wealthy patron and a sensational media, transformed the discovery from a quiet academic find into a global spectacle. Every day that passed increased the stakes, ratcheting up the pressure on Carter to deliver the spectacular vindication he had promised. You feel the dry desert wind whisper the word gold. It's a powerful, corrosive word that contaminates the pure archaeology with the grime of avarice. The waiting game was not just about patience. It was about the ethical line being drawn and possibly crossed in the sand. The stage was set, the script was written, but the players were rehearsing a secret shadow play in the weeks before the official curtain rose. The agonising wait is finally over. The date is November 26, 1922. Lord Carnarvon has arrived, accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, both impeccably dressed and radiating a privileged air that seems jarringly out of place in the dusty primal valley. You watch as the two men, the meticulous excavator and the aristocratic patron, exchange brief, formal greetings. Beneath the polite surface, however, is the shared, almost unbearable tension of the moment. Carter's years of hope, Carnarvon's mountains of money, all come down to this single day. You're back at the site, where the top of the descending staircase has been cleared once more. The second sealed doorway, the one at the end of the descending passage, has been fully exposed. This door leads to the tomb proper. It is exactly as Carter described it. A plastered rubble wall, still bearing the necropolis seals of the jackal and the cartouche of Tutankhamun, but with clear evidence of 2 successive resealings, the telltale sign of ancient break-ins and resecuring. The mainstream historical fact is that this second door was actually only partially blocked. It was a secondary barrier. The primary concern was the first door now cleared. After the first door was meticulously cleared and documented, the passage beyond, leading to the second door, was filled with rubble. Carter's team painstakingly cleared this passage fill, an operation that took several days. It was here, in this passage fill, that the first objects were found. Shattered pottery, broken boxes and fragments of gold foil. These fragments were crucial, not because they were valuable, but because they confirmed the narrative. The robbers had definitely entered and dropped things in their haste, and the ancient officials had then filled the passage entirely to block further entry. The presence of these objects also suggested the robbers were quickly interrupted or panicked. The atmosphere is electric. Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn and Calendar are the only 4 non-Egyptian people present, surrounded by the loyal, silently expectant workmen. Carter takes a tool, a small iron boring rod, and with surgical precision he makes a tiny hole, no bigger than the head of a pin, in the upper left-hand corner of the second sealed doorway. He knows this is the moment of truth. He's deliberately avoiding the lower, more intact seals, aiming for the area that ancient officials had patched. You hear the faint, dry sound of the boring rod crunching through the plaster and the chips of limestone rubble. Then, silence. Carter carefully enlarges the hole just enough to insert a candle. This is the iconic moment that has been told and retold, but you are seeing the tense, silent reality. He holds his breath. You hold yours. He inserts the candle through the hole, the flickering flame cutting a weak cone of light into the darkness that has been absolute for 33 centuries. The heat from the lamp is immediately drawn into the chamber by the rush of stale, oxygen-starved air escaping into the passage. For a moment, a long, drawn-out eternity, Carter says nothing. The silence is broken only by the sound of his own heavy breathing. Carnarvon, unable to bear the suspense, finally asks the question that would become history's most famous line of archaeology. Can you see anything? Carter's reply is the most famous line of all, the one that cemented the romance of the discovery. Yes, wonderful things. And here is where the deeper story of the day begins, where historians still argue whether his reply was honest or simply the perfect theatrical line. The quirky tidbit that casts doubt on the sincerity of the moment is that Carter, a man of meticulous record-keeping, never described the scene in his own journal with the breathless poetry that his famous reply suggests. Furthermore, the light from a single candle passing through a pin-sized hole would have illuminated only a small fraction of the antechamber. Given the chamber was packed floor to ceiling with large dark objects, it's highly unlikely Carter could have instantly gauged the scale and wonder of the entire collection with that single glance. The theory is that the famous line was the product of a pre-planned theatrical moment, crafted to feed the public hunger for romance and treasure. Or, if you believe the theory of the clandestine entry you discussed earlier, Carter wasn't seeing things for the first time. He was looking at a familiar sight, now performing the moment for his patron. The sheer confidence and immediate dramatic payoff of his response suggests he already knew what lay beyond the door. It was the delivery of the payoff, not the discovery itself. What Carter did see, even with a small hole, must have been spectacular. The glint of gold, the monumental shapes of animal couches, and the stacked furniture. The impression must have been overwhelming. He has seen enough to know that this is not an empty tomb, but a repository of a pharaoh's life and death. You watch as he pulls back from the hole, his face a mask of restrained emotion. The decision is immediate. The hole must be enlarged, but only after proper documentation. He orders the opening to be resealed and the scene meticulously photographed. He has confirmed the existence of wonderful things, and that is enough. The gold is safe for another night. The pressure on the nobleman and the archaeologist is finally released in a glorious rush of shared victory. The age of Tutankhamun has officially begun. The immediate aftermath of Carter's famous utterance, "Yes, wonderful things," is a rush of activity, but one strictly controlled by the 4 non-Egyptian witnesses. You feel the profound shift in the atmosphere from cautious hope to absolute triumphant certainty. The single candle thrust into the darkness had, for a fleeting moment, illuminated what 3,000 years of darkness had preserved. The contents of the tomb's first major chamber, known as the antechamber. The official, public opening, the scene that would later be immortalised in photographs, occurred the following day, November the 27th, 1922. Carter carefully documented and photographed the sealed doorway, then enlarged the hole. You are the invisible 5th member of that breathless party as Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn and Calendar pass through the small breach and step, for the first time in millennia, into the antechamber. The sheer, staggering volume of the contents is the first thing that hits you. The room is not large, perhaps only 26 by 12 feet, but it is packed to the ceiling, a breathtaking, chaotic explosion of objects piled upon one another. The mainstream historical fact is that the antechamber alone contained over 700 individual inventoried items, an unparalleled collection of funerary furniture, chariots, statues, and chests. This was not a neat, orderly museum display. It was a glorified storage unit, packed with the functional and symbolic items deemed necessary for the young pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Your eyes, and those of the official party, are immediately drawn to the gold. It is everywhere. Gilded couches in the shape of fantastic animals, a lion, a cow, and a composite beast that is part hippopotamus, part crocodile, dominate the centre of the room. These weren't merely pieces of furniture, they were symbolic biers for the deceased king. Stacked against the walls are 4 dismantled chariots, their gold and electrum appliques shining dully in the light of the electric lamps that have now been rigged up. Everything glitters, reflecting the light in 1,000 tiny precious points. But it's the chaos that tells the real story. The objects are scattered, jumbled and stacked haphazardly. A box of food lies next to a gilded throne. Ceremonial shields rest atop chests of linen. This confirmed the earlier suspicion drawn from the resealed door. The ancient robbers had definitely made it inside. They didn't have time for a systematic plunder. They smashed open chests, pulled out easily portable gold and oils, and scattered the rest in their frantic search. It was a clear sign of hurried vandalism, not the total methodical clearance seen in other great tombs. The ancient necropolis officials, who later resealed the door, were clearly successful in interrupting the theft before it became a total loss. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the almost unbelievable state of preservation is the finding of a beautifully carved alabaster cup, often called the wishing cup. Inscribed on its rim are the words, "May your car spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north, wind, with your eyes full of happiness." Carter describes lifting it and realizing that the last person to have touched it was someone who had loved the king, a person performing a heartfelt rite 3 millennia ago. This cup wasn't just gold, it was a direct sentimental connection to the human moment of the burial. The fragility of this object, surviving the centuries and the ancient intrusion, made its presence all the more miraculous. The centerpiece, however, is the entrance to the next chamber, the burial chamber. It is blocked by an immense 12-foot-high wall, also plastered and sealed. But this barrier is flanked by 2 life-size statues of the king, facing each other, clad in gold kilts, and holding golden maces like silent, eternal guardians. They are standing rigid sentinel over the final resting place. The presence of these towering, vigilant sentinels confirmed that the burial chamber, the sanctuary containing the actual sarcophagus, had not been successfully breached. And here is where historians still argue whether the initial sense of being overwhelmed led to immediate ethical lapses. The sheer volume and value of the finds were paralysing. Carter, in his journals, mentions the difficulty of simply moving without crushing priceless artifacts. The environment was unstable, the air was stagnant and likely carrying spores, and the team was tiny. Critics suggest that the immediate priority, given the chaos, should have been the stabilisation of the room and a photographic inventory. Instead, there's evidence that the most pressing task became the selection and removal of smaller, high-value objects that could be easily secured or potentially taken off the official inventory. The temptation, staring at untold wealth, was simply too much for the already financially and professionally stretched Carter and the profit-seeking Carnarvon. This room, filled with wonderful things, became the site of a profound ethical compromise that would haunt the Discovery's legacy. The real treasure lay just beyond the Golden Sentinels, and the pressure to reach it quickly, combined with the difficulty of securing the antechamber, created a blind spot in the official, meticulous documentation process. The sheer, blinding spectacle of the antechamber is now the official history. You've seen the chariots, the gilded couches, and the 2 golden sentinels guarding the sealed wall, but as you stand in the dust-filled, oppressive air of the chamber, you realise the official narrative is already beginning to crack under the weight of its own stunning success. This section is where we confront the sticky, uncomfortable reality of the ethical compromises made in those first few frantic days and weeks. The mainstream historical fact is that the first priority for Carter and his team, after securing the chamber, was an immediate, meticulous inventory and photographic record. This task, begun on November the 29th, 1922, and lasting nearly 2 months, involved the systematic removal and cataloguing of those 700-plus items in the antechamber. Carter's genius lay in his meticulous record-keeping. A detailed, hand-drawn map of the location of every object, a written description, and a photographic plate, often taken by his dedicated photographer Harry Burton, before anything was moved. This rigour is what distinguishes the Tutankhamun discovery from the reckless treasure hunts of the past. However, you already know the darker whispered truth. The intense pressure, the financial reality, and the sheer human temptation created the perfect storm for what is now widely accepted among historians, the untold early looting by Carter and Carnarvon. This is not a theory based on gossip, it is a conclusion supported by mounting circumstantial evidence and later forensic analysis of the tomb's contents and the official records. The core of the argument rests on a few compelling pieces of evidence, a quirky tidbit you won't find in the glossy coffee table books, the missing jewels. When the king's mummy was finally unwrapped years later, several very high-value, small and easily concealable pieces of jewellery and gold ornaments were found placed inside the wrappings, suggesting the ancient robbers missed them. Yet, a large number of similar, small and equally valuable items, like gold rings, pectorals, and finely worked amulets, that should have been in the chaotic antechamber were never officially inventoried. These objects were exactly the size and value ancient robbers would have targeted, but they also happened to be the perfect size for a modern excavator to discreetly pocket. The box of samples. Years later, after Lord Carnarvon's death, his stepmother, Lady Almina, was approached by an Egyptian government official who presented her with a wooden box containing various small artefacts, including a beautiful gold breastplate and a golden shrine. These items had no official provenance from the tomb. The official stated they were samples given to Lord Carnarvon by Carter early on, presumably before the official inventory began. This box is the smoking gun, providing direct evidence of objects being removed and separated from the official find. The cleared passage. You remember the narrow passage leading from the antechamber to the sealed burial chamber. When officially documented, it was found to be almost completely clear of debris, yet the debris in the main antechamber was piled high. The theory is that Carter and Callender needed to get a quick, secret look into the burial chamber to ensure the main prize, the sarcophagus, was still intact. To do this, they had to clear the passage of the rubble the ancient officials had used to reseal it. They used the early days of securing the site to quietly remove the rubble and, critically, any portable gold objects the ancient robbers might have dropped there. Historians still argue whether this was simple opportunistic theft for personal gain, or a form of finder's fee compensation that Carter and Carnarvon felt entitled to after 15 years and a vast personal investment. The ethics of archaeology in the 1920s were murky, and the concept of partage, the legal division of fines between the government and the excavator, was still widely practiced. By taking a few smaller items off the books, They were guaranteeing themselves some immediate reward, regardless of the protracted political battle over the main public treasure. You realise this early, clandestine activity is the necessary ugly engine that drives the beautiful public story. Carter, the professional, needed the gold to secure his legacy, and Carnarvon, the patron, needed it to justify his immense expenditure. Their secret acts, probably carried out under the cover of night, when only the most trusted crew members were present, allowed them to maintain the public facade of rigorous, unblemished scientific discovery while hedging their bets. The removal of these samples happened precisely during this period, before the official global press descended. Carter needed to buy time to create the perfect narrative, one of pristine discovery, and the best way to do that was to control the information and ensure the financial backer was immediately rewarded. This act of quiet, selective pillaging is the silent counterpoint to the glorious public photographs being taken by Harry Burton. The gold gleams in the official photos, but the real intrigue lies in the small missing items that were never meant for public view. The secret anxieties and ethical compromises of the initial weeks are now firmly behind Carter and Carnarvon, buried as deeply as the tomb entrance was just a few short weeks ago. The focus shifts entirely to the public relations machine, a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to turn a lucky find into a glorious, unblemished triumph of British archaeology. You realise that the greatest artefact found at Tutankhamun's tomb might not be the golden mask, but the meticulously constructed narrative itself. The mainstream historical fact is that the official, formal opening of the antechamber to the dignitaries and the world press did not occur until February 1923, nearly 3 months after the initial discovery. This delay was strategic. It gave Carter and his small trusted team the crucial time to remove, tag, photograph and stabilise the hundreds of objects in the antechamber, ensuring that when the press did arrive, they would see not a chaotic mess of scattered rubble and plundered goods, but a clean, dramatic and well-managed site. This control was key to shaping the global perception. You stand with the assembled group on that designated day, a flurry of tweed, starched collars and notebooks. There are Egyptian officials, American archaeologists, French experts, and crucially an eager, competitive group of journalists. Carter, ever the controlling figure, is now transformed into the master of ceremonies. He is meticulous in his presentation, guiding the official party through the cleared passage, past the point where the first door had been, and into the antechamber, where the remaining furniture and massive gilded couches are dramatically spotlit. The press was manipulated with an almost surgical precision. The quirky tidbit that demonstrates this manipulation is the exclusive contract Lord Carnarvon signed with the Times of London. For a considerable sum, the Times was granted sole rights to publish all news and photographs related to the discovery. This move instantly infuriated every other newspaper in the world, particularly the American papers like the New York Times, who had significant investment in their own foreign correspondence. This exclusivity meant the narrative was filtered, controlled, and delivered with a specific, heroic slant. Howard Carter, the solitary British genius, bankrolled by the benevolent Lord Carnarvon, makes the ultimate discovery. Any negative information, the signs of ancient looting, the rumours of early unofficial entry, the growing tension with the Egyptian authorities, was carefully suppressed. The rest of the world's journalists were treated appallingly. They were kept at bay, given scant, often deliberately misleading updates, and forced to rely on hearsay and rumour, which only amplified the sense of mystery and drama surrounding the site. This manufactured secrecy quickly fostered a deep resentment among the press, which ironically became the engine for the later, more sensationalised stories, most notably the infamous Curse of Tutankhamun myth, which was largely born out of the media's frustration and revenge against Carnarvon's tight control. You realise that this entire event was a performance, designed to fulfil a psychological and political need. The moment the official party stood before the sealed door of the burial chamber, flanked by the 2 towering golden sentinels, was the ultimate climax. This was the visual proof, the solid, unbroken wall and the vigilant guardians, that the main prize, the sarcophagus and the king, were still untouched. The fact that the burial chamber was sealed from the inside by a solid wall, unlike the plastered entrance door to the antechamber, was the perfect theatrical flourish. And here is where historians still argue whether the Times exclusivity deal was a necessary evil or a major ethical failure. On one hand, the money from the Times was essential for funding the immense, multi-year conservation and cataloguing effort that followed. The scale of the find was such that only a dedicated, well-funded operation could preserve it. On the other hand, it fundamentally corrupted the free flow of scientific information, turning a discovery of global human heritage into an aristocratic, profit-driven spectacle. Many scholars believe the long-term damage of that press policy, the creation of the tomb curse myth, and the subsequent anti-British sentiment ultimately outweighed the immediate financial gain. The staging was a phenomenal success. The world became utterly consumed by the story of the boy king and his treasures. The photographs of the gilded artefacts, carefully cleaned and illuminated, were splashed across front pages globally. Carter and Carnarvon became international superstars, the heroic duo who had triumphed over 2 millennia of silence. But beneath the triumph, the pressure cooker of Egyptian nationalism was building. While the world focused on the gold, the Egyptians were watching their heritage being monopolised and narrated by a foreign power. The staging of the official opening was the glorious peak of the British narrative, but it was also the turning point that would lead directly to the inevitable clash over ownership and control. The gold was out, the press was managed, but the political storm was brewing. The worldwide frenzy generated by the staged opening of the antechamber is the bright spotlight. You, however, must turn your gaze to the shadows where the real political drama is unfolding. The glamour of the discovery is being rapidly eclipsed by the growing resentment of the Egyptian authorities. This isn't a story of merely finding gold, it's a story of national sovereignty and cultural heritage, a battle fought over artefacts that legally belonged to Egypt but were controlled by foreign hands. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1922, Egypt was not a fully independent nation. While it had been granted nominal independence by Britain earlier that year, the British retained significant control over key areas, including defence and the administration of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, EAS. The head of the EAS was Pierre Lacour, a Frenchman, whose primary allegiance was to the Egyptian government, but whose effectiveness was often curtailed by British influence. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb occurred at the precise moment when Egyptian nationalism, fueled by the desire for true self-governance, was reaching a boiling point. The control of this unprecedented find became a potent symbol of this struggle. You can sense the rising tension between Carter and Lacour. Carter, backed by the money and aristocratic influence of Carnarvon, viewed the tomb as his scientific project, one he had the right to manage and control down to the smallest detail. Lacour, representing the Egyptian government, viewed the tomb as national property, a crown jewel that must be secured and exhibited for the Egyptian people. The two visions were incompatible, and the contract under which Carter was digging was the flimsy battlefield. The contract, based on old concession laws, included the controversial principle of partage, or division of fines. The expectation generally was that if a tomb was found intact, the Egyptian government would keep the royal artefacts, and the excavator might be rewarded with a selection of less significant duplicate objects. However, when the tomb of Tutankhamun was revealed, its sheer wealth and historical uniqueness rendered the idea of partage obsolete and ridiculous. No amount of duplicate artefacts could compensate for the loss of a single major piece of the treasury. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the almost deliberate provocation by the British side. Lord Carnarvon, capitalising on his exclusive deal with the Times, insisted on total control over all photography, access and information. He even had the temerity to suggest that the Egyptian government should be grateful that the tomb was found and conserved by a British team, an attitude that was deeply condescending and inflamed Egyptian public opinion. When Egyptian officials demanded greater access and transparency, they were often treated as obstacles rather than as the rightful owners of the finds. The inevitable clash came when the sheer volume and complexity of the antechamber required Carter to expand his workforce, bringing in several more international experts, a specialist photographer, a chemist, and a draftsman. The Egyptian authorities, already suspicious, demanded that these personnel be approved, and that Egyptian staff be trained and integrated into the conservation work. Carter, notoriously protective of his control and distrustful of bureaucratic interference, dragged his feet and resisted. The political climate deteriorated quickly, transforming the atmosphere from one of scientific collaboration to one of open antagonism. Historians still argue whether Carter was genuinely acting in the best interest of the artefacts, or simply obsessed with maintaining personal control and maximising the public narrative under his Times contract. The counter-argument is that Carter's meticulous methods did ensure the best possible conservation at the time, arguing that the Egyptian Antiquities Service lacked the specialised skills and resources to handle such a delicate, large-scale operation. Critics, however, point to his deliberate exclusion of Egyptian voices and his patron's arrogance as proof that the primary motive was one of colonial dominance over a cultural resource. This escalating tension created the perfect environment for the political manoeuvrings that would follow. Every delay, every perceived slight was amplified in the local press. The discovery, meant to be a moment of shared human triumph, quickly morphed into an international incident, a powerful symbol of colonial-era appropriation. The stage was set for the next confrontation, the physical and ceremonial breaking of the final sealed wall, the one guarded by the Golden Sentinels, which would lead to the burial chamber and the ultimate prize. The political shadow cast by the initial discovery is long and dark. The beautiful golden objects were being catalogued, but the real cost was the relationship between the excavators and the nation they were working in. The gold was safe, but the control over the gold was about to become the subject of a bitter, defining international dispute. This dispute, simmering just below the surface during the antechamber clearance, was waiting for the final, most spectacular moment of the discovery to boil over. The tension in the antechamber is almost unbearable, a blend of scientific eagerness, political rivalry, and spiritual apprehension. You stand before the final imposing barrier, the sealed wall that separates the antechamber from the burial chamber, the sanctuary of the king. This is the ultimate moment of truth, the climax of Carter's 15-year quest, the payoff for Carnarvon's investment, and the flashpoint for Egyptian nationalism. The mainstream historical fact is that the antechamber clearance was a painstakingly slow process, taking from late November 1922 to mid-February 1923. It was only after this essential, meticulous work that Carter and Carnarvon could focus on the final sealed doorway, flanked by the two magnificent golden statues of the king. On February 17th, 1923, with a selected group of officials, dignitaries and journalists present, though carefully controlled as always, the work began to dismantle the mud-plastered rubble wall. You watch as Carter, with the same surgical precision he used on the first door, orders the removal of the masonry. Unlike the first, externally sealed door, this wall was built from the inside and was meant to be the permanent final closure. The presence of the two golden sentinels standing watch amplified the drama. As the stones are carefully removed, you can hear the faint hollow echo of the picks, signalling the vast, undisturbed space beyond. Once the hole is large enough for a man to pass through, Carter, followed by Carnarvon, is the first to enter. You slip in right behind them. The sight that greets you is not the expected chaotic pile of gold, but a monumental, blinding vision of serene, overwhelming size. The entire chamber is dominated, almost entirely filled, by a gigantic rectangular structure of beaten gold. It is not a sarcophagus yet, but the first gilded shrine, a colossal canopy that completely envelops the pharaoh's actual stone sarcophagus. The dimensions are breathtaking, 17 feet long, 11 feet wide, and 9 feet high, constructed from heavy timber and covered entirely in thick sheet gold, gleaming with lapis lazuli and coloured glass inlays. It is a golden wall, decorated with the sacred symbols of the netherworld, creating a sense of total, inviolable majesty. The quirky tidbit that strikes you immediately is the unexpected size and scale of the shrine. Ancient Egyptian royal tombs often contained nested coffins, but to have 4 massive nested shrines, one inside the other, all fitting tightly into a relatively small chamber, was completely unprecedented. The complexity of the installation, the difficulty of getting these massive pieces into the tomb and assembling them in the cramped space, is a testament to the immense, hurried labour of the funerary party. You realise the tomb was built not to display the wealth, but to hide the king behind layers and layers of symbolic and material protection. The atmosphere in this chamber is different from the antechamber. There is no sign of the frantic ransacking that occurred in the outer room. The seals on the ropes tying the doors of this first shrine are intact, unbroken, and bearing the definitive official seals. This confirms the most important fact. The burial chamber was inviolate. The ancient robbers had been stopped short by the final plastered wall, the one you just witnessed being dismantled. However, The immense sense of relief and triumph is quickly followed by a moment of anticlimax that historians still argue about. When the initial inventory and sketches were made, it was noted that while the main shrines and the sarcophagus within were sealed, the burial chamber itself was almost empty of the sort of high-value objects that filled the antechamber. The gold shrines dominated the space, but there were no scattered jewels, no golden boxes on the floor, and none of the small, personal treasures that had been scattered in the outer room. Where were they? One school of thought argues that the ancient thieves, having broken into the antechamber, knew the prize was beyond the final wall, but realised they did not have the time or tools to dismantle the thick masonry and the multiple, massive shrines. They took what they could from the outer room and fled, leaving the main prize untouched. The other, more cynical argument, one you are privy to, is that the ancient thieves did make it into the burial chamber through a tiny breach that was quickly repaired, only to find the shrines too large to dismantle quickly. And, more pertinently, that the lack of small portable gold objects here is evidence that Carter and Carnarvon, during their secret early foray into the tomb, may have quickly accessed this chamber as well through a small resealable hole near the top of the wall, removed a few samples of the smaller, high-value ritual items placed around the shrines, and then resealed their own small hole before the official opening. This explains the later finding of certain small ritual daggers and other golden objects, whose documented location seemed suspiciously vague. Regardless of the past ethical compromises, the site is overwhelming. This is the heart of the tomb, the true resting place of the king, protected by layer upon layer of golden symbolism. The immediate priority, after the initial documentation, is the staggering task of dismantling the 4 gilded shrines, which would take weeks of methodical, painstaking labour before the true stone sarcophagus would finally be revealed. The gold is not just an artefact, it is a cage, protecting the king's body and challenging the modern excavators to respect the sacred nature of the ancient nested protection. The golden light reflecting off the first gilded shrine is almost blinding, yet you feel a profound chill. You're now fully within the sacred core of the tomb, the burial chamber, a space entirely dedicated to the preservation and eternal resurrection of the king. The immense size of the golden shrines, 4 nested one inside the other, like colossal Russian dolls, is a physical testament to the hurried yet thorough devotion of the funerary priests. The very scale of the undertaking presents the modern excavators with their greatest challenge yet. How do you dismantle a monument that was never meant to be opened? The mainstream historical fact is that the removal of these 4 gilded shrines was an operation of staggering complexity and duration, consuming nearly an entire year of careful work, from February 1923 to February 1924. These weren't hinged boxes, they were heavy wooden frameworks covered in gold, sealed by copper staples and ropes. Carter, ever the perfectionist, couldn't just tear them down. He had to meticulously document every decorative panel, every single rope, and every minute detail of their construction before and during removal. The largest shrine had to be dismantled in situ because it was too large to fit through the doorway they had created. You watch the process unfold in slow motion. First, the ropes sealing the doors of the outermost shrine are cut. You notice the intact clay seals crumble to dust, the final physical evidence that no one, not even the ancient necropolis officials, had broken this barrier. Then the immense gilded panels are carefully lifted out and winched up and out of the tomb, a process that required the ingenuity of Arthur Callender to create a sophisticated system of pulleys and rollers. The dust from the centuries-old gold covering the panels is everywhere, hanging heavy in the air. As each shrine is removed, the space in the burial chamber shrinks, and the next, slightly smaller, but equally magnificent golden shrine is revealed. Each successive shrine is decorated with slightly different, more complex iconography, drawing the eye inexorably toward the centre. The sheer repetition emphasises the sanctity of the object they enclose. The quirky tidbit that demonstrates the almost chaotic nature of the final construction is the state of the 4th and innermost shrine. When this final layer of the golden canopy was removed, it was found that the shrine had been placed so tightly against the walls of the burial chamber that the space between the shrine and the wall was almost negligible, less than an inch in some places. This caused several panels of the shrine to be slightly bent or damaged during the original installation. This detail confirms the haste of the burial. The king died unexpectedly, and the funerary priests had to work with prefabricated shrines that were clearly too large for the modest tomb they had prepared for him. The immense effort to wedge the 4 shrines into that small room is a silent testament to the drama of the 18th dynasty's close. Finally, after months of nerve-wracking labour, the 4 golden shrines are gone, and you stand before the heart of the tomb, the stone sarcophagus. It is a massive block of reddish-yellow quartzite, roughly the size of a modern car, resting heavily on a low alabaster platform. Its lid, a huge slab of pink granite, has been cracked across the middle, almost certainly from the weight of its own displacement during some ancient earthquake, or perhaps the stress of installation. It is beautiful, simple, and utterly solid. This moment raises the most critical question that historians still argue. Was the sarcophagus opened by the ancient thieves? The granite lid is intact, but its sheer size required modern engineering to lift. You watch as Carter and his team, using heavy jacks and ropes, slowly lever the lid free inch by agonizing inch, the granite groaning against its stone base. When the lid is finally lifted, it reveals not the king's mummy, but the first anthropoid coffin. It is a wooden coffin, thickly covered in gold foil, carved in the image of the young king, his arms crossed over his chest, holding the royal crook and flail. And this is where the nested system begins again. Inside the quartzite sarcophagus are 3 nested coffins, all in the shape of the king. The outer 2 are of gilded wood, richly decorated with semi-precious stones and glass paste. The 3rd, the final resting place, is the subject of the next, even more intense moment of revelation. The sight of the anthropoid coffins protected by the massive stone sarcophagus confirms the success of the ancient resealing. The thieves were stopped short. But the immense layers of protection, stone, then gold, then gilded wood, then more gold, make you realise that the most intimate personal treasures are still hidden. The gold on these nested coffins is not merely decorative. It is a sacred investment, intended to guarantee the king's safe passage to the next life. The final coffin, the ultimate shell, waits to be opened, promising the closest, most spectacular encounter yet with the boy king himself. The process has been long, but the ultimate prize and the secrets it holds are inches away. The moment of ultimate revelation is at hand. You are breathing the stifling air of the burial chamber, standing before the final innermost shell, the 3rd nested coffin. The 2 outer coffins, made of gilded wood, have been painstakingly removed, revealing this ultimate container, resting on a heavy bier inside the stone sarcophagus. The sight is absolutely stunning, yet profoundly different from all that came before. The mainstream historical fact about this final coffin is that it was not made of wood, like the others, but of solid gold. It is approximately 6 feet, 1 inch long, and its weight is a staggering 242 pounds, 110 kilograms. This isn't just a covering, it's a massive, precious metal shell crafted in the image of the young king. The gold is inlaid with coloured glass paste and semi-precious stones, including carnelian and lapis lazuli, creating a dazzling representation of the resurrected pharaoh, Osiris. The discovery of a solid gold coffin was unprecedented, and immediately cemented the Tutankhamun find as the richest tomb ever unearthed. The problem, however, was immediately apparent. When Carter and his team exposed this final coffin in October 1925, they found that the second coffin, which rested inside it, had been doused with immense quantities of unguents and resins during the funerary rites. Over the millennia, these ritual oils had hardened and solidified, essentially gluing the second coffin to the solid gold 3rd coffin and the 3rd coffin to the stone sarcophagus. The attempt to simply lift the solid gold coffin free was impossible. You watch as Carter, pushed to the limits of his meticulous patience, tries every conceivable method. They attempt to loosen the resin by passing wires underneath the coffin. When that fails, he attempts to expose the coffin to the brutal heat of the Egyptian sun, hoping the resin would melt. For a quirky tidbit of conservation history, the coffin was hoisted out of the sarcophagus and placed on rollers in the courtyard for a week under the glaring sun. This failed to melt the stubborn, pitch-like substance. This desperation led to the most controversial step in the entire excavation. With the king's body now virtually inaccessible, Carter felt he had no choice. He ordered his men to use heated knives and tools to literally cut the solid gold coffin away from the hardened resin and the remains of the second coffin. You hear the disturbing high-pitched scrape of metal against gold, a sound of violation that contrasts sharply with the intended solemnity of the room. This necessary destruction was later heavily criticised by archaeologists, but Carter argued that the preservation of the mummy, the king himself, was the ultimate goal, and this drastic step was required to reach it. Once the solid gold coffin was finally opened, the king's mummy was revealed. It was a moment of profound silence, a direct confrontation with the man whose life and death had defined this quest. But the most immediate and lasting image was not the mummy itself, but the spectacular, exquisite object covering its face and shoulders, the golden mask. This mask, made of 2 sheets of hammered high-carat gold, inlaid with semi-precious stones, is the single most recognisable artefact in the world. It weighs over 22 pounds, 10 kilograms, and depicts the idealised image of Tutankhamun, wearing the Nemes headcloth and the royal beard. It was intended to serve as a substitute head, ensuring the car spirit of the king would recognise its body even after the decay of the millennia, but the real untold story lies beneath the mask and the linen wrappings. As Carter and his team began the delicate, gruesome task of unwrapping the mummy, a process that would take months, they discovered the personal jewellery and amulets placed directly on the king's body. There were over 140 individual pieces of gold, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and glass ornaments placed between the various layers of linen bandages. These were not the massive public treasures of the antechamber, but intimate protective items, pectorals depicting winged goddesses, intricate necklaces, dozens of rings, golden sandals and protective amulets designed to guide and safeguard the king on his journey. Here is where historians still argue whether the wealth of these personal amulets was deliberately understated by Carter in the early stages of the discovery. Given the rumours of early looting, the fact that so many small, easily concealable pieces of gold were found inside the mummy's wrapping suggests that ancient thieves were thwarted. They never got past the stone sarcophagus. However, the sheer quantity of these individual items, and the fact that they were recovered from the most secure part of the burial, only intensified the suspicion that similar portable items found outside the wrappings may have been spirited away by the modern excavators. The gold on the king's body was sacrosanct and documented, but the temptation around the edges of the tomb was enormous. The removal of the mummy from the final gold coffin was the last act of the excavation's physical discovery phase. Carter had done it. He had found the king, and he had secured the gold. But the sheer scale of the wealth, and the drastic destructive conservation methods used to access it, ensured that the story of Tutankhamun's discovery would forever be tainted by a necessary yet brutal act of archaeological violation. The king was finally exposed, but the ethical arguments surrounding his discovery were just beginning to be unearthed. The exposure of Tutankhamun's solid gold coffin and the subsequent, difficult work on the mummy brought the discovery to its peak of scientific triumph, but it simultaneously triggered a global media frenzy that transformed the narrative forever. You are about to witness the moment the meticulous, documented science of Howard Carter is utterly subsumed by a sensational, lucrative and manufactured myth, the curse of Tutankhamun. The mainstream historical fact is that Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's wealthy patron, died suddenly in Cairo on April 5, 1923, just 5 months after the official opening of the antechamber. He had suffered an insect bite on his cheek, presumably a mosquito bite, though some accounts suggest a cleaner's razor cut it later, which became infected, developing into erysipelas and then blood poisoning. Already weakened by the debilitating car accident he'd suffered years earlier and suffering from complications including pneumonia, Carnarvon succumbed to the infection in the pre-antibiotic era. He was 56. The moment of his death was perfectly timed for maximum sensationalism. The world was already fascinated by the tomb's treasures, and the press, particularly those outlets who had been frozen out by Carnarvon's exclusive deal with the Times, were eager for revenge and a story that could compete with the gold. The stage was set for a spectacular piece of journalistic hyperbole. You hear the initial reports fueled by furious speculation and resentment. It's a quirky tidbit of media history that the American newspapers, desperate to break the Times' monopoly, were the first to aggressively push the curse angle. They latched onto vague, unsubstantiated rumours, such as the claim that a clay tablet found outside the tomb warned of death to those who disturbed the king's rest, and amplified them into a global phenomenon. the media's thirst was immediately quenched by a series of sensational details surrounding Carnarvon's demise. The most famous and most theatrical detail was that at the precise moment Carnarvon died in Cairo, the lights across the entire city supposedly flickered and went out, plunging the Egyptian capital into darkness. Simultaneously, back at his English estate, Highclere Castle, Carnarvon's beloved terrier Susie let out a mournful howl and suddenly dropped dead. You can't make this stuff up, or rather the journalist did make this stuff up, or at least twisted two unrelated events, a common power outage in Cairo and the death of an old dog, into proof of supernatural vengeance. The story was irresistible. The arrogant aristocrat who disturbed the ancient dead was struck down by a pharaoh's mystical power. The curse myth was less about ancient magic, and more about modern media economics, a profitable, thrilling narrative that sold newspapers across continents. It provided a morality tale. The gold belonged to the king, and the Westerners who dared to take it would pay the ultimate price. This myth was given further credence by the subsequent, sometimes untimely, deaths of several other people connected to the discovery over the following years. These deaths included Carnarvon's half-brother, a prominent radiologist who x-rayed the mummy, and a close friend of Carnarvon who visited the tomb shortly before his own death. The reality, of course, is that a group of middle-aged, often sickly men travelling and working in Egypt in the 1920s, a time of rampant disease and poor sanitation, would naturally experience a higher-than-average mortality rate. But this logical, actuarial fact was no match for the thrilling narrative of the curse. You observe Carter's reaction, which was one of profound disgust and scientific frustration. He detested the sensationalism, viewing it as a gross insult to the meticulous work he and his team were performing. He tried, often fruitlessly, to counter the wild rumours with sober, scientific facts, but the public preferred the thrill of a vengeful mummy to the reality of septicemia or blood pressure complications. Here is where historians still argue whether the press had a legitimate claim to the story, given Carnarvon's exclusive contract. The argument goes that Carnarvon's selfish desire to monetize the discovery by selling the exclusive rights to the Times deprived the global press of access to objective scientific facts. In retaliation, the excluded press created the ultimate piece of fake news, the Curse of Tutankhamun, which ironically became the single most enduring public legacy of the find. Was the curse myth a legitimate critique of colonial control, or just petty journalistic spite? It's hard to untangle the two, but the myth served as a potent counter-narrative to the clean, heroic story Carter had tried to construct. The death of Carnarvon also had a swift, profound political effect. The partnership was broken. The Egyptian government, under the new nationalist leadership, immediately seized on the confusion and the popular sentiment against the British control of the tomb. The struggle over ownership and access, simmering since the antechamber opening, now boiled over into an international crisis. The sensationalised death of the patron provided the perfect, emotionally charged backdrop for the political demands for full Egyptian sovereignty over the tomb's contents. The myth of the curse, therefore, was not merely a good story. It was a powerful political tool that directly aided the Egyptian government in reclaiming its heritage. The death of Lord Carnarvon, and the spectacular myth of the curse that followed, did more than just sell newspapers. It provided the perfect chaotic cover for the beginning of the end of the official pristine narrative of discovery. You have watched the story progress from a secretive hope to a triumphant vindication. But now you must confront the messy, inconvenient truths that began to surface only decades after the main actors were gone. The golden facade of the great discovery began to peel away, revealing the compromises beneath. The mainstream historical fact is that the political turmoil following Carnarvon's death led to a temporary but dramatic closure of the tomb by the Egyptian government in early 1924. Carter, furious at the interference and the loss of his authority, refused to comply with the new demands for greater Egyptian supervision and access. This was the peak of the political struggle. Carter and his foreign team were physically locked out of the tomb they had found. It took months of negotiation, diplomacy, and the eventual, reluctant concession by Carter to the Egyptian government's terms, which essentially guaranteed full sovereignty over the finds for the work to resume in late 1924. This confrontation highlighted the fundamental clash between colonial-era entitlement and rising nationalism. It was during this period of forced stoppage and subsequent renewed scrutiny by the now empowered Egyptian officials that the cracks in Carter's meticulous records began to widen. Carter was an obsessive record keeper, but even his system could not hide the evidence of earlier, unauthorized removal of artifacts. A quirky tidbit that casts significant doubt on Carter's claimed rigor is the analysis of the tomb's 4 small side chambers, known as the treasury, the annex, the burial chamber, and the antechamber. Carter's published records show a chaotic, jumbled arrangement of objects, which he attributed entirely to the ancient robbers. However, later analysis of the photographs taken by Harry Burton, Carter's official photographer, revealed clear signs that objects had been moved or staged before the official photography took place. Specifically, items of low value or duplicate items were often placed on top of or in front of high value items, perhaps to discourage a quick inventory or theft by the ancient robbers, but the overall placement seemed far too chaotic even for a hurried plundering. More damningly, the later discovery of the stolen samples in Carnarvon's possession, as discussed in Section 10, gave context to the discrepancies. You realise that the stolen samples box was the smoking gun, and its existence forced later generations of historians and archaeologists to look with new eyes at the official inventory. Why were there a small golden shrine and a gold pectoral in a private collection with no official provenance? The most logical conclusion, which historians now widely accept, is that Carter, possibly with Carnarvon's direct or indirect approval, had made an unauthorized entry into the tomb shortly after the initial discovery, perhaps via a hidden hole in the treasury wall, and removed a selection of small, high-value objects. This is the point where historians still argue whether Carter should be judged by the ethical standards of his time or by modern archaeological protocols. Critics argue that his actions were a blatant breach of his contract and a theft of national heritage, driven by personal greed or the need to compensate his patron. Defenders argue that in the early 1920s such informal removal of samples or a finder's fee was a common practice, and that without his early compromises and absolute control, the rest of the tomb's vast contents would likely have been conserved to a far lower standard or scattered by less professional authorities. The fact remains, the perfect discovery narrative was a necessary lie, and the missing artifacts are the silent evidence of the real, flawed history. The greatest irony in the unravelling is the evidence found on the king himself. When the mummy was finally fully examined, it was noted that the embalmers had been remarkably generous with the amount of gold and jewellery they placed within the mummy's wrappings, over 100 items. This suggests that the ancient robbers were indeed stopped before they reached the core. But the very existence of these objects also suggests that if similar items found outside the wrappings were later found to be missing, the most likely candidate for the removal was the modern excavator who had unlimited secret access to the site during the initial tense weeks. The official narrative of a single heroic excavator finding a perfectly preserved, untouched tomb is a beautiful, simple story. The reality is far messier, a highly complex, partially looted yet spectacularly wealthy tomb, discovered by a brilliant but ethically compromised archaeologist working under the auspices of a moneyed patron, all set against a backdrop of colonial tension. The truth is scattered, just like the objects the ancient thieves dropped in their hurried retreat. The gold is spectacular, but the knowledge that pieces of history and the full honest account of their discovery are missing forever casts a long shadow over the enduring legacy of the boy king. The final chapter of the discovery is not the finding of the gold, but the ultimate legacy it left behind, both for archaeology and for the world's understanding of ancient Egypt. You've witnessed the entire sweep, the desperate hope, the initial triumph, the ethical compromises, the political firestorm, and the ultimate sensational tragedy of the curse myth. Now, as the dust settles, literally and historically, you reflect on what really endured and where the true truth of the boy king lies. The mainstream historical fact that defines the legacy of Tutankhamun's tomb is the sheer volume and quality of its contents. Over 5,398 registered items were found in the 4 chambers. This unparalleled treasure trove became the single greatest source of information about the 18th dynasty funerary practices, artistic style, and technology. Before this discovery, Tutankhamun was a footnote, a minor pharaoh whose memory was deliberately erased by his successors, the military kings of the New Kingdom who sought to dismantle the religious reforms of his father, Akhenaten. Carter's find dragged Tutankhamun from obscurity and made him the face of Egyptian antiquity, paradoxically granting him the eternal life the ancient priests had so desperately sought for him. The years following the opening of the tomb were dedicated to the immense, daunting task of conservation and cataloguing. Carter, despite his flaws, was an absolute genius at this work. It took him 10 grueling years, from 1922 to 1932, to fully clear the tomb and ensure the preservation of every single object. You imagine the work. The conservators struggling to stabilise the gold leaf that crumbled when exposed to modern air, the chemists developing techniques to solidify 3,000-year-old resins, and the engineers devising ways to lift the massive sarcophagus lid without damaging the underlying coffin. The commitment to meticulous documentation and conservation, often driven by Carter's singular will, remains the great unassailable triumph of the project. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the lasting human quality of the artefacts is the king's personal linens. Among the objects found were numerous fine linen cloths, some embroidered, and many of the clothes the king wore as a young man. Carbon dating later confirmed that one piece of linen found in the tomb had been woven just a year or two before the king's death. This small fact, the existence of an ordinary perishable item surviving intact, brings the boy king closer to you than any golden statue. He was a young man who wore clothes, ate food, also found in the tomb, and went to bed, a human being tragically elevated to the status of a god. The final physical rest of the king is perhaps the most solemn part of the story. After the study and documentation were complete, Tutankhamun's mummy was placed back inside his final, quartzite sarcophagus. The lid was resealed and the tomb was closed. The king remains there today, a powerful contrast to the thousands of objects that were removed and eventually housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. His tomb, KV62, is now open to the public, one of the few places where you can stand in the presence of an actual pharaoh. This act of leaving the king in the valley while moving his possessions to a national museum represented a profound resolution to the political crisis, affirming the Egyptian government's commitment to scientific preservation while respecting the ancient sanctity of the burial site. And here is where historians still argue whether the discovery ultimately served archaeology or sensationalism more effectively. The argument for archaeology points to the revolution in field methodology. Carter's meticulous recording methods became the new global standard for excavation. His collaboration with specialists like chemists and photographers demonstrated the necessity of a multidisciplinary approach, forever changing how treasure hunts were conducted. However, the argument for sensationalism points to the fact that the vast majority of the public, even today, remembers the discovery not for its methodology, but for the curse, the gold, and the aristocratic drama. The media spectacle created by Carnarvon's exclusive deal and fueled by his subsequent death elevated Tutankhamun to a pop culture icon, distracting from the necessary duller truths of scholarship and political tension. The boy king became famous for being famous, a modern celebrity resurrected from an ancient grave. The unravelling of the official narrative, the discovery of the stolen samples, and the realisation of Carter's small secret acts of plunder forces us to re-evaluate the very concept of the heroic archaeologist. We accept now that Carter was a man of his time, subject to the intense pressures of finance, ego, and colonial entitlement. The most honest legacy is a recognition that even in the greatest scientific triumphs, human fallibility and ambition are always present. The gold is real, the history is real, but the story we were told was a carefully polished facade designed to hide the complexity of the colonial encounter and the simple truth that, given the chance, even the most meticulous scientist can be tempted. The truth, like the tomb, was slowly and deliberately uncovered, step by frustrating step. The story of Tutankhamun is not a story of an untouched resting place. It is the story of a second chance. The tomb was briefly violated in antiquity, but the ancient officials resealed it, giving the king back his peace. It was then violated again in the 20th century, but this time the world was left with the dazzling, if incomplete, record of his afterlife. We gained a pharaoh, but we lost a piece of history's untainted truth. The final whisper of the desert air curls around the columns of the great temple, carrying away the noise of the day's digging and the long-ago shouts of the newsboys. You feel the cool kiss of the Egyptian night on your skin, the silence deep and settling, pulling you down into the restful oblivion beneath the sand. It's time now to leave the boy king to his layered slumber, surrounded by the golden light of eternity and the solemn memory of those who sought him. Let the questions about what was taken and what was given back drift away like the fine desert dust. The history is written, the gold is secure, and the drama is over. You have faced the truth and survived the curse of a beautiful lie. Everything is now quiet. The deep time of Egypt embraces you. Let your mind ease away from the complexities of kings and curses and rest fully in the peace of the present moment. Allow the soft hum of the fan or the quiet pulse of your own breath to be your final anchor. You're safe, you are home, and the secrets of the valley will guard your sleep.